If you have your copy of the Scriptures, I invite you to turn to the Gospel of Matthew chapter 5. In verse 13. As we think on the subject, real Christianity. Real Christianity. Jesus says, "You are the salt of the earth, but if salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled under people's feet. You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden, nor do people light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a stand, and it gives light to all in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to you, to your Father who is in heaven." My prayer for all of us is that God would touch our hearts in such a way that as we continue in our series on the Sermon on the Mount, that not only are these messages right and true and worthy of what God has for us to hear, but that you and I would say, this is how I want to live my life. This is how I want to live my life, according to the words of Jesus. This is how I want to live. And let me tell you why. You may think you're insignificant. You may think that you're not very important. You may think in the grand scheme of things that you're a nobody. But let me tell you something. If you are a Christian, you've had a born-again experience with Jesus Christ. You understand that the only way to get into heaven is by the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ. That you're saved by God's grace and not by your own works. If you have truly had a born-again experience with Jesus Christ, then you can make an incredible difference in this world. You can. All because Jesus said, "You are the salt of the earth and you are the light of the world." So don't ever underestimate how important you really are in the grand scheme of the kingdom of God. I heard about a man who was walking through the state fair. And there was a little girl that came walking by him, and she had this big old fluff of cotton candy on a stick. And that fluff of cotton candy was almost as big as that little girl. And so the man stopped her and said, "Honey, I want to ask you a question. How can a little girl like you eat all that cotton candy?" And she looked up at him and said, "Mister, I'll tell you something. I'm a lot bigger on the inside than I am on the outside." Well, that is true of you if you're a Christian. It's true of me as a child of God. We may not be much on the outside, but we are huge on the inside because Jesus said we are salt and we are light. Now, when Jesus said to his disciples, "You are the salt of the earth and you are the light of the world," what did he mean? How am I to pour out the salt and turn on the light? Well, look at what Jesus said beginning in verse 13. And let me share with you 3 things that will allow you to make an incredible difference in this world. We see he says, "You are the salt of the earth." First of all, we have to shake the salt on a decaying world. Shake the salt on a decaying world. Now, why does Jesus refer to us Christians as salt? Because salt is a miracle. I'm sure most of you, either at a restaurant or at home, probably you ate some salt yesterday or even this morning on your food. You put salt on something, and it was not really a big deal for you to do so. And to us, it's not a big deal. We go to the store and buy salt all the time. And as you know, salt is a very simple chemical compound, sodium and chloride, but it's a miracle. If you take hydrochloric acid and pour it over your hand, what's going to happen to your hand? You're not going to have a hand in a little bit. If you drink hydrochloric acid In just a few moments, you will die an agonizing death. But the incredible thing is you can take sodium and add that sodium to the same hydrochloric acid, and boom, you've got one of the most useful substances on earth, salt. But you see, what we take for granted was very valuable in the days of Jesus, and let me tell you why. Salt is a preservative. Back in the days of Jesus, they didn't have refrigerators or freezers. They didn't have what we have today that can preserve our food for a lengthy period of time. Back then, the only thing they had to preserve food was salt. And salt was so valuable that they would even trade it for gold ounce for ounce. As a matter of fact, did you know that we get the word salary from the word salt? You see, Roman soldiers were actually paid in salt. And if a Roman soldier did not do his job, he didn't get all the salt that he should have gotten. And that's where we get the phrase, he's not worth his. Exactly. Salt was very, very valuable. Now, why did Jesus call Christians salt? Well, just like meat will decay without salt, and just like food will rot without salt, this world is decaying and this world is rotting. And Jesus said it's your job and my job to preserve the holiness of God in a decaying world and to preserve the goodness of Jesus in a rotting world. We need to be salt. But Jesus said there's a danger. Again, look at verse 13. But if salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? Now that's kind of a strange thing that Jesus said, because any chemistry teacher will tell you that in one sense of the word, salt can never lose its flavor. You can't make salt unsalty. Salt is always salt. Sodium chloride is one of the most stable compounds in the universe. It never changes. It never loses its character. But yet there is a truth to what Jesus is saying. In Israel, the Jordan River flows into the Dead Sea. The Dead Sea is 1.5 miles below sea level, the lowest point on earth. When the water gets into the Dead Sea, there's no place to go. And because of that, the salt builds up in the Dead Sea. But then the sun begins to evaporate that water, and around the Dead Sea, you can see huge piles of that white substance that you and I call salt. Now, it is salt, but it isn't just salt. It is salt mixed with other minerals and other elements in the Dead Sea. And when that salt gets mixed in with those other elements, it becomes possible that with a little dampness in the air for that salt to be dissolved and that salt to dissipate. And when that happens, what happens is what Jesus is saying here. It loses its flavor. You say, now, what does that have to do with me? Well, just this. If you're a Christian, the worst thing you could ever lose is not your wealth, your health, your family, or even your life. If you're a Christian, the worst thing you could lose is your witness, is your testimony. There is no loss like losing your testimony. It's like the salt losing its flavor. You lose your testimony. Your salt has lost its seasoning. You say, well, why is that such a big deal? Because Jesus goes on to say, it's then good for nothing. So, Rick, what's the one thing that can contaminate the salt of my life? Well, the dirt of worldliness can do that. Listen, when we conform to the culture, instead of transforming culture, we lose our seasoning. We lose our saltiness. And that's why Jesus goes on to say, it's good for nothing but to be thrown out and trampled underfoot by men. Now, what does that mean? Well, the only source of salt that Israel had back in the day was the Dead Sea. And many times they would get that salt out of the Dead Sea, but they were not able to separate the minerals that contaminated that salt from the salt itself. And because of that, you couldn't put the salt on the food because it tasted flat and it was repulsive. And you couldn't put the minerals on the food because it could be poisonous. You couldn't throw the salt out in the yard or where you live because it would kill everything around it. There was only one thing they could do with it. They would take that salt and they would throw it on their roads, and people would walk on that salt, and they would ground that salt into the dirt, and it would become like a fine, gravelly pavement, and people would just walk all over it. So with that in mind, let me tell you what I think Jesus is saying here. It's very possible that the church is being walked on by the world today. We're being walked on. Don't fool yourself. There is very little respect in the world for the church today. But do you know why? Because we have become too much like the world. And that's why the world has no respect for us as the church. The average Christian tells the same dirty jokes the non-Christian tells. The average Christian uses the same foul language that non-Christian uses. The average Christian goes to see the same dirty movies that the non-Christian goes and sees. The average Christian listens to the same music that non-Christians listen to. The average Christian doesn't read his Bible any more than the average non-Christian. And you know what the problem is? The average person outside the church looks at the average person inside the church and says, if that's all the difference Christianity makes, why bother being a Christian? If that's the only difference Jesus makes, then why do I need Jesus? I don't need Jesus to talk that kind of talk and live that kind of life and walk that kind of walk. And that's what our problem is. The majority religion in America is Christianity, and yet Christian values no longer dominate America. Humanism dominates America. Secularism dominates America. Materialism dominates America. So we got to keep it. Jesus said, you are the salt of the earth. Let me tell you something that should be obvious. Salt is worthless if it never comes in contact with food. What good is salt if it never gets outside of the salt shaker? You say, well, what's that got to do with me? Well, listen. Do you know what this church is? This church is a big, gigantic salt shaker. And as long as all we do is come here and get into our little holy huddle every Sunday and do nothing more, we will never make a real difference in this world. Because you know what God wants to happen every Sunday? He wants to turn the salt shaker upside down and pour you and me out into our schools and workplaces and sports teams and neighborhoods so that we can make a difference where we live, work, play, and eat. I know there are some of you, and I sympathize with you, you're thinking about how you wish you could find another job, another place of employment, because every single person you work with is lost without Christ. According to Jesus' words, that's wonderful. Guess what you get to be? You get to be salt. Listen, everybody you work with may be a bunch of heathens, a bunch of pagans, all those cards and cat fans. But listen to me, why do you think God has you where He has you? He wants you to be salt. We need to get the salt out of the shaker and onto the earth where it can do some good. You work in that business where everybody cusses like a sailor and runs around on their spouse. Be salt. You play on a ball team where nobody gives a rip about Jesus. Be salt. You live in a neighborhood full of lost people. You be salt. Now, here's the second thing Jesus wants us to do. Shake the salt on a decaying world, but also He wants us to shine the light on a darkened world. Shine the light on a darkened world. Look at verse 14. You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden. Now, salt relates to our character, but light relates to our conduct. Salt deals with what we are, but light deals with what we do. And you know what light does? Light attracts. If we were to turn off all the lights in this room and make it totally dark, and I lit a match, every eye would be on that match, because that's what light does. It attracts. It dispels the darkness. Now, it ought to be obvious, but the reason Jesus commands us to shine His lights is because we live in a world that's totally in the dark. When it comes to spiritual things, this world doesn't have a clue what's going on. They are in the dark. I'm reminded of other places the Bible speaks about us being the light of the world. In 2 Corinthians chapter 4 and verse 6. For God, who said, "Let light shine out of darkness," has shone in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. In Philippians chapter 2, verse 15, that you may be blameless and innocent, children of God, without blemish, in the midst of a crooked and twisted generation, among whom you shine as lights in the world. Ephesians 5:8, for at one time you were darkness, but now you are light in the world. Walk as children of light. Now, some of you may be thinking, now wait a minute. Jesus said he was the light of the world, and now he tells me I'm the light of the world. So what's the deal with this? Well, you go outside some night when the sky is clear and take a peek at that beautiful moon that lights up the night sky. Jesus is the sun, like the S-U-N. We are the moon. Just as Jesus is the light that reveals God, we are to be the light that reflects God. We are to be a mirror that reflects the light of Christ shining in our hearts every moment of every day. I read about a little boy who went with his family into one of these big cathedrals with these beautiful stained glass windows. And on every one of the windows, there was a different Christian. Matthew on one, Mark, Luke, John, Paul, so forth. And he looked at those stained glass windows with those Christians on them, and he looked at them as the sunlight streamed through the windows. And he asked his mother, "Mama, who are those men on those windows?" And she said, "Oh, those are the saints." He looked at them and said, "Well, now I know what saints are." She said, "Oh, yeah? What is a saint?" And he said, "A saint is somebody that lets the light shine through." And that's exactly what a saint is. You let the light of Jesus shine through your life. And look at what Jesus goes on to say in verse 14. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden. I know you remember the song, "This Little Light of Mine." But you see, here's what our problem is. Too many Christians think they're in the secret service. And they're not letting their light shine. You're a Christian, but people would think that you're in the secret service because you never share your testimony. You never shine your light. You never talk about Jesus. Some of you go to work and you work with businessmen and women, and you may go out to eat for lunch and you don't bow and pray because you're too embarrassed because the other people don't bow and pray. You know what you're trying to do? You're trying to put your light under a bushel, trying to hide your light. Jesus said, you can't put a light under a bushel. You need to be a light in a dark world. Jesus didn't say you can be salt. He didn't say you should be light. He said you are salt. He said you are light. And do you know what that means? That means shake the salt on the decaying world, shine the light on a darkened world, and finally share the truth with a dying world. Look at verse 16. In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven. So now we come to the million-dollar question. How do you know whether or not you're being salt? And how do you know whether or not you're being light? How do you know you're being what Jesus said, being salt and being light? How do you know if you're shaking the salt, and how do you know if you're really shining the light? Well, Jesus doesn't leave it to chance. He makes it clear, and here it is. He said, if men see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven, that's how you know if you're being salt and light. So let me tell you something. If you're a Christian, I'm convinced that the two greatest days in your life are these. Number one, the day you're born again is the greatest day of your life. But the tragic thing is that most Christians don't understand the second greatest day of their life. Because the first greatest day of your life is when you're born again, but the second greatest day of your life is the day you wake up and understand why you were born again. Listen, you were not born again just so that you would go to heaven. You were born again to be salt and light on this earth. You were born again to be salt in a decaying world. You were born again to be light in a darkened world. That's why you're here. Someone has well said that the mark of a saint is he makes it easier for others to believe in God. Well, you'll know your salt is tasty, and you'll know your light is bright when you're drawing other people to give their heart to Christ. And you're drawing other people to say, I want to know the God you know and glorify the God that you know. I heard about a man who was teaching a boys' Sunday school class, and he was trying to illustrate this point. And he pointed to his watch, and he asked his class, boys, what is that? And they said, a watch. He said, well, what's a watch for? And they said, to tell time. He said, well, now suppose that watch doesn't keep time. Suppose it does everything else, but it doesn't keep time. So what's it good for? They said, it's good for nothing. He took out a pencil and said, what's this? And they said, a pencil. He said, what's it for? They said, to write. He said, well, suppose something's wrong with the lead and it won't even make a mark. It's defective. What's it good for? They said, it's good for nothing. He then pulled out a pocket knife. He said, what's this for? And they said, to cut things. He said, well, suppose that knife is so dull it won't even cut paper. What's it good for? And they said, it's good for nothing. He then looked at the boys and said, boys, whatever else you do, wherever else you go, however high you make it, if you do not glorify God by the way you live, and if you don't bring other people to glorify God, then what are you good for? And they said, good for nothing. And that's exactly what Jesus said. He said, in the same way, let your light shine before others so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven. See, God has not called us to be self-centered and self-consumed, ignoring the dark and decaying world around us going to hell. God has called us to shake the salt out on a decaying world and shine light on a darkened world and share truth with a dying world and bring as many men, women, boys, and girls as we can to glorify our Father who is in heaven. Because I'm here to tell you, that's not only the only way to live, but if you'll be salt and if you'll be light, you can make a difference for God in this world.